So we're going to look at the rise of a few Central European powers. Specifically, we're going to look at Austria and Hungary, and we'll do a little detour out to Eastern Europe to take a look at the Ottoman Empire, which we've kind of ignored up until this point, but is certainly worth bringing into the picture because they go to war with Austria. So first, we need to have kind of a better understanding of the social structure in Eastern and Central Europe as compared to Western Europe. So we have this bizarre situation following the Black Death where in Western Europe, peasants are gaining freedom. And they are getting more economic rights, they are getting more political rights. Their lot in life is generally improving. Where in Eastern Europe, the freedoms that peasants had previously enjoyed, they began losing, and there's this move back towards serfdom and away from the rights that peasants had typically enjoyed. And so serfdom, as this operative condition that we should understand, is its condition of bondage. It's basically essentially slavery, just by a different name. And the serfs are tied to the land that they are born on, and they are tied to working for the lord whose family they are born into, and they don't have a choice in their life. This is just what they are forced to do for their whole lives. And this is their lot. And eventually, this becomes hereditary subjugation, where they're forced to pass on this condition of serfdom to their children and on forever, as a perpetual cycle of misery and failure. And so the lords in Eastern Europe are able to take away the rights of the peasants, whereas, in Western Europe, they weren't able to do so. And the way that they do this is by having kings pass laws that remove the peasants' ability to leave the manor without permission. Basically, it's movement restriction, right? You're not allowed to leave unless I expressly give you permission, which is just crazy. Like, you cannot leave my work unless I do this. And then the other thing they do is they just take the peasants' land and increase their labor obligation. So essentially, like, you are not independent farmers who pay me rent. I own the land. You are sharecroppers, and you have to work a certain number of days a week for me, not for you. And that number of days varies. Sometimes it's 2, and sometimes it's up to 6 days a week, and you get Sunday off to go to church. And do whatever else it is that you need to do, right? And that's not really like a good model. You don't want to be a serf. It's a problem. And the peasants are unable to fight back because legally the local lords serve as the judge and the jailer. So what are you going to do? Who are you going to complain to? The local lord? Hey, you're working me too hard? I don't think you're going to get very much sympathy from that person. And so this is problematic for the peasants. And this is why they move towards condition of serfdom instead of conditions of freedom. And why that happens, we'll get to in a second. So again, just this re-emphasis of what we're talking about in terms of conditions here. Peasants are overworked in order for the nobles to gain as much as possible. Essentially what happens is the nobles overwork the peasants, take the raw materials that they get and sell it to Western European merchants who are able to take it and convert it into finished products. So you see that the West is getting super wealthy and developing commerce and an economy, a basic rudimentary economy, while the East is staying super poor, relying on just their raw natural resources instead of developing any sort of commercial economy. And this then presents even fewer opportunities for the peasants to break free. So Western Europe is always far wealthier than Eastern Europe. That trend kind of continues to this day, right? That never really changes. And the reason that they're able to do this is because of the political structure in the East. So in the West, in Western Europe, we see the kings gaining power while the nobles lose it, coming out of the feudal system. And in the East, what we're really left with is the remnants of the feudal system. The nobles are more powerful than the kings. They get their way. The king is essentially first among equals, and the king doesn't have a strong standing army. The king doesn't have an ability to enforce his laws. He's reliant upon the nobles to do his bidding. And if they choose not to, they choose not to. And there's not a whole lot he can do about it. The nobles are able to then control the king's courts. They're able to prevent peasants from changing anything. They're able to control the legal courts because the king has no power to appoint judges or anything like that under this system. And so this weakness from the kings allow the nobles to kind of do whatever they want. And part of that is they remove old restrictions. And old restrictions used to say, like, you have to sell a certain amount of your product to the local cities. That way these cities can grow and develop. And the nobles basically say, you're not going to stop me. And they start selling it to Western merchants. And this is problematic for the development of the economy in the East, as I mentioned before. Eastern cities were no longer free spaces for runaway serfs. So these serfs were not, like in the West, cities were essentially sanctuary. If you made it there, you could find a career, you could start doing something else, and you couldn't really be forced to go back to work for the local lord or wherever you ran from. In the East, those same protections aren't guaranteed. And so because of this, less people move to Eastern cities, and those Eastern cities never really develop because, one, they lack the population, but two, they lack any skilled workers coming into them. And so we see that in this time period especially, but throughout European history, Eastern Europe really, really, really lags behind Western Europe. So let's then focus our attention more towards Central Europe, although this you could still consider this Eastern Europe, what they're going to do. When we talk Eastern Europe, we're specifically talking in this time about the kingdoms of Poland and Russia, but also a little bit of Austria as well. So here's the deal. The 30 Years' War ends, if we recall, in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. When that war ends, we remember that the Holy Roman Empire essentially divides pretty significantly into 300 different factors, with princes ruling the various local areas. The title of Holy Roman Emperor still exists, and it still belongs to the Habsburg family. Remember the Habsburgs all the way back to Charles V. But the Habsburgs, the Austrian Habsburgs, not the Spanish branch, although they retain the title of Holy Roman Emperor, they don't really have much power that goes along with that. It's more a title without any power. They don't have much sway. And so they have to look east in order to expand their empire, because looking in their old domains, which would be the Holy Roman Empire, it's too fractured. Looking west is France, which is becoming a strong absolutist monarchy under Louis XIII and Louis XIV. And down to Italy is just a little bit too messy to go down there, especially with the power of the Pope. They don't want to offend him. So they have to look east to expand their political power and territorial ambitions. Problem is, when they look east, there's a giant empire over there called the Ottomans, which we'll get to in a minute. But that's setting the stage. So how do we get to this point? We get to this point by going back even into the 30 Years' War. And Ferdinand II, if you recall, one of the first stage of the 30 Years' War was called the Bohemian stage, or the Bohemian phase. And that's fought in the area of modern-day Bohemia, which is in Germany. During this phase of the war, Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor, the Austrian Habsburg king, or emperor, I should say, is a more accurate statement for him, he defeats the Czechs, which is Bohemia, at the Battle of White Mountain. And this is very early in the 30 Years' War. And after he defeats them, he really makes an effort to take control back from the nobles in that region. And the way he does that is he reduces the power of what's known as the Bohemian Estates. And the Bohemian Estates is a local parliament, right? Like a local representative government, essentially. All the local nobles gather and they make laws that affect that whole area. So he reduces their power and says, basically, you don't have the right to make these decisions. Those belong to me, your emperor. He also takes land away specifically from the Protestant nobility. We'll recall that Ferdinand II is a Catholic emperor, hence the Holy Roman Emperor, and he's ruling in an effort to reassert, and he's fighting the 30 Years' War in an effort to reassert Catholicism throughout the empire. So he takes away land from the Protestant nobility, and then he gives this land to foreign fighters, people who had fought in the war on his side, Catholics who had fought the war on his side. And so suddenly the nobility in Bohemia are no longer the native Protestant Czechs, but rather these new nobility who owe everything that they have to this Habsburg emperor. So they're less likely to cross the emperor because they know that if they cross the emperor, just as he put them into a position of power, he can take all of that power directly away from them. And so they're afraid of that. And this allows the Habsburgs to have really strong direct rule over Bohemia. And again, Bohemia is really the modern-day Czech Republic and parts of Germany. And so we see that in Bohemia, peasants are forced to work 3 days a week in unpaid labor, and that could be up to 6 in certain areas. It just kind of depends on who your nobleman was, what the local regulations and expectations were, those sorts of things. and Protestantism is banished. So in all of this, we see efforts by the Austrian and Habsburg as like they're taking efforts to reassert absolutism. They want to get rid of this whole concept of sharing power with the nobles. They want to get rid of this concept of divided provinces within their empire, and they want the emperor to rule absolutely. So they are successful in Bohemia, and they're able to consolidate their power in these two territories, Bohemia and Austria, and so they begin looking east towards Hungary, an area that they had previously tried to conquer but had been unsuccessful. The Ottomans were floating around under there, and so the next two rulers of the Austrian Habsburgs, Ferdinand III and Leopold I, both look east to expand Austrian holdings. And so we'll see that Austria kind of controls this area, Lower Austria, Upper Austria. This is Bohemia. This is Tyrol. You see this area down into the Dalmatian coast down here. And they're looking for Hungary in this area, and the Ottoman Empire is over here. So they push east to try to expand their empire to be a little more successful. So Leopold leads Austria to war with the Ottomans, and this initially is unsuccessful. So in 1683, the Ottomans besiege Vienna. Vienna is the capital of Austria, right? So the Ottomans get all the way to the capital, and there's really this kind of moment of crisis where there's this fear that this Muslim nation is going to overrun Christendom and really kind of end Christianity as we knew it in Europe. And so a lot of the Christian nations gather together, and they're able to defeat the Ottomans, this coalition of Habsburgs, Austrians, Saxon, Poles, and Bavarians. So all kind of coming in from this Holy Roman Empire. And they're able to push the Ottomans all the way back. You have two other major powers, Venice, which was super powerful, and Russia, who's floating around up here, are also fighting the Ottomans. Again, you have this kind of coalition of Christian nations fighting against the Ottoman Muslim Turks. And so we see like really rapid success from Austrians, and they're able to push back and take control of Hungary, which is this area, and Transylvania, which is even further over here. Hungary, including Budapest. This is in 1648. So the Austrian Habsburgs are able to take over significantly more territory this way, into more of what is modern-day Hungary. This is Hungary. Transylvania is floating around on this side off the map. And so this success expands the Austrian power. The problem is that Austria is really divided into kind of three distinct territories. There's Austria itself, the homeland that is directly ruled by the emperor. Then there's two other smaller, they call them kingdoms, the Kingdom of Bohemia and the Kingdom of Hungary. And those three areas each have their own estates, which is kind of gatherings of local nobility to make local laws and enforce edicts from the monarch. And the only thing that holds them together is their common emperor, their common ruler, the Habsburg king. Otherwise, they're completely different people. I mean, you have the Czechs, you have Austrians, and then you have Hungarians, and they don't speak the same language, they don't have the same culture, they don't have the same history. These are completely different people we've got going on here. And so that's really important, because that makes it really difficult for the Habsburg emperors to really bring everything together. Like I mentioned before, each area has its own laws. Nobles rule estates in each territory. They have less power, but they kind of have their own power. And Charles VI is the emperor at this point in the 1700s, and he sees that this is problematic. He sees that really they need to have a strong emperor to hold them together, and he has a problem in that he does not have a son. He only has a daughter, and her name is Maria Theresa, and we'll come to her later. But because he recognizes this fractured nature of the Austrian Empire, he announces something called the Pragmatic Sanction. And what the Pragmatic Sanction says is that the Habsburg lands will forever and always be united. They can never be divided amongst heirs, and they must pass on to one person. This is a way of kind of circumventing any efforts by people to claim authority over his daughter. He's saying that she is the rightful ruler, she is the rightful heir, she gets all of my land. And he specifies that this heir could even be female, which is rare, but he specifies that because, again, he only has a daughter. He does not have a son. So that's Charles VI and the Pragmatic Sanction, which is really an important event that we should be remembering. There is real resistance to the Habsburgs. And the main resistance comes from Hungary. They don't like being ruled by an Austrian because they are Hungarian. They are different people. They speak different languages. They have different cultures. They're not interested in that. And they always, no matter what the Austrians do in an effort to establish absolutism, the Hungarians are always there to thwart them. At every step of the way, the Hungarian nobility prevents Austria from really consolidating their power. And part of why this is the Hungarian nobility is huge. There are estimates that 5 to 7% of the Hungarian population is from the nobility. That is a gigantic number. So there's a lot of powerful, wealthy people in Hungary who are willing to stand up and fight against the Austrians. And so they do this often. And part of the reason why they do this is because they're Protestant and they're so not interested in the forced Catholicism that comes with the Austrian Empire. And the forced Catholicism is kind of this legacy from the 30 Years' War and the struggles within the Holy Roman Empire. The Austrian Habsburgs weren't interested in ruling a nation that was divided by religion. They wanted everyone to be the same. And so they really resist heavily to the point where eventually, although they agree to work with the Austrians, they maintain some sense of independence, and they're never fully part of the Austrian Empire. And at some point, we'll start referring to it as the Austro-Hungarian Empire, because in the future, they end up with two kings, a king of Hungary and a king of Austria, who co-rule. Because they just simply, the Hungarians just never submit to the will of the Austrians. They just don't want to do it. That's not their interest. They're fiercely independent and strong and proud people. And so that's Austria, right? The Habsburg family in Austria is constantly trying to secure absolutism. And they do in Bohemia and at home by suppressing the old nobility, by creating the new nobility, by passing laws that limit the religious freedom. And they're able, through that manner, to control their population and establish absolutism. And that's a pattern we've seen before, by the way, in France and in Spain. They are just never able to succeed in doing that in their third province, which is Hungary. So, given that, let's talk briefly about the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire is really important because, as you see here, they control a huge swath of territory. They control all of North Africa, all the Middle East, all around Southeast Europe, up into the Russian area. I mean, they control huge amounts of territory, and they reach the height of their power underneath the leader of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. And this is in the early 1500s. They follow Islam. They're an Islamic empire, but they promote religious freedom. Man, they don't care who you are or what God you follow so long as you paid their taxes. And so in 1529, they push all the way to the gates of Vienna. And I mentioned before they do it again in the 1600s. But in the 1500s, it's very much a threat. And Europe again rallies kind of behind to defeat this threat. But even though they don't capture Vienna in 1529, they threaten Eastern Europe. And they control the Balkan region, which is right down here, Southeastern Europe, Greece, Macedonia, Croatia, those sorts of territories. And so the Ottoman Empire is this kind of constantly existing force in the southeast corner of Europe. And what's really interesting about the Ottoman Empire is they run kind of a different government than the rest of Europe. First, all agricultural land is controlled and owned personally by the Sultan, the ruler. He owns all the land that produces food, so he's kind of a wealthy dude. They don't have hereditary nobility. They have a really complex bureaucracy and government that's based off meritocracy. So people get people get promoted based off their skills. And they're only there for their lifestyle. It doesn't necessarily pass on to their kids. And because of this, the Sultan is able to protect the peasants from these local officials. They don't have free reign because they know if they do something that offends the Sultan, they're kicked out. And so this is a really important distinction between them and Eastern Europe. And their bureaucracy, their government is run not necessarily by individuals who have like this vested interest and are playing this political game, but it's ruled by slaves. And we'll see in a second how these become slaves. And so these, because they're slaves instead of hereditary nobility, they're not concerned about passing their lands on to their children or their titles or any of that sort. They're more concerned with just making sure things go well. And these slaves come from the Balkan region. And it comes from this program where every year the Ottomans demanded the sacrifice of a few thousand Christian children. Kind of the strongest, the best, and the brightest young men are sent, and their children, and they're sent to the Balkans to be raised. They're sent from the Balkans to Turkey to be raised in the Ottoman Empire as Muslims. And they first serve in the army, and this becomes known as the Janissary Corps. And the Janissaries are the most talented, the best equipped, and the strongest portion of the Ottoman Empire. And if the slaves in the Janissary Corps show that they are competent and successful, they can be promoted out of the army and into the government bureaucracy. And this is how they fill the ranks of their government, is they bring in these former Christian children who become Muslim slaves and raise up their army that way. Despite this seeming intolerance, the Ottoman government really relies heavily on religious tolerance. And what they do is essentially in each region, each nation is considered a millet, a nation. And they allow for basically self-government under the religious leader. So if you're in, say, Greece, they appoint a Greek Orthodox leader to lead the Greek Orthodox in Greece. They appoint a Jewish leader and a Muslim leader. And those three leaders kind of run their respective religious groups. They make sure that their religious groups pay taxes. They make sure that their people are following the law. They enforce the law, and they get to enforce their own cultural laws because they are only responsible for their group. And so because of this, there's this real strong bond between the Ottoman Empire and religious leaders, this willingness to embrace every religious group without oppression creates great tolerance, and this creates wealth among the empire because these people who are skilled and talented and being kicked out of other nations show up here. So the Ottomans really peak in the 1500s. At that point, Suleiman the Magnificent dies, and they kind of become this, well, they start to fall apart, although they'll last all the way through World War I. So it takes them a long time to collapse. This is a really important, powerful empire. And so slowly they succumb to infighting and fall apart. And they're just kind of hanging out in Eastern Europe from the 1600s on, and we'll revisit them again because the Poles and the Russians are constantly trying to take their land because it's really wealthy and valuable land. So that's the Ottoman Empire. The last nation or empire that we will look at is Prussia. And so Prussia is really kind of this complex and confusing bit of European history. So, to take a step back, at the beginning of the 30 Years' War in 1618, there are two territories, Brandenburg and Prussia, and they are not united. Brandenburg is in modern Germany, Prussia is further east. They become united under the Hohenzollern family. And the Hohenzollern family, the reason this unites is that one of the branches dies out, and so the cousin acquires all this land. And so the ruler in Brandenburg is one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Emperor. And we had talked about this before. This is a really important political title. They essentially just appoint next in line to the throne, but being an elector brought a lot of prestige and political influence. And so we'll refer to these people then as electors, essentially from here on out. And so this is an important title. Brandenburg is an important place. Obviously, you don't earn this title without having some sense of importance. And so during the 30 Years' War, there is a ton of fighting that happens around Brandenburg. It completely destroys the territory. The population drops drastically. Entire villages disappear. And so this is problematic for Brandenburg, because when you have entire villages disappearing, you suddenly start to lose your economy. And because of this, the power of the nobility was greatly weakened. Less peasants to work the land. That means less wealth for the nobles. A lot of the nobles die in the fighting. So some of these lines die out. These family lines die out. So suddenly, the weakness of the nobility opens the doors for absolutism to the electors of Brandenburg, Prussia. And the first one who's able to do this is Elector Frederick William. And he comes to power in 1640, and then he rules for 40 years, all the way until 1688. And he is known as the Great Elector because of what he is able to do. The main thing is He's working to consolidate Prussian absolutism. And he takes away power of the traditional representative right. So he's taking away the power of the local estates. And there are essentially three different estates, because Frederick William's governing three different territories. Brandenburg, the old homeland, Prussia, which is further east, and then there's scattered territories along the Rhine and Western Germany, which he's just able to acquire all through his various family connections. So each of those territories have their own estates, and remember, estates are local provincial governing bodies, essentially like little mini senates that rule local regions. And this is a problem because taxes could not be raised without the consent of the local estates. So if Frederick William, the great elector, wants to raise taxes in Brandenburg or in Prussia or in his territories along the Rhine, he really needs the support of the local estates. And that's difficult for him. And specifically the estates in Brandenburg and Prussia, but also along the Rhine, are dominated by the nobility and landowning class that were known as the Junkers. And the Junkers and initially the electors and eventually the kings of Prussia are constantly fighting and at war. And so at war with each other, not actual war, but, there's hyperbole there. But constantly battling to see who's going to have more power. Eventually, Frederick William is able to win this long struggle and gets the ability to raise taxes in certain regions without the consent of the estates. And the reason he's able to do this is essentially he guarantees them he'll leave alone their traditional rights and property rights and their ability to suppress the peasants into serfdom. And in return, he's able to raise taxes however he wants to. So that's kind of the difference that's kind of the deal he makes in order to get the support of the Junkers. Frederick William then decides he needs to create a strong standing army. And he's able to force then this consent to tax in order to protect and pay for a standing army, right? He says, look, you remember the 30 Years' War. You remember how terrible that was. You've got to pay for this standing army, so we need to raise taxes. And this consent, of course, then leads to the decline in the power of the estates, right? As soon as they give him an inch, he keeps taking more and taking more and taking more. And he's able to triple the revenue during his time as elector. Like, the amount of money that's flowing into his government is insane by the time he's done. And he uses that to increase the size of his army by 10 times. He grows it significantly to eventually an army that's over 30,000 people strong. In a country of 1 million people, that is a huge number at this time. The concept of a 30,000 man army during this era is really, really large. And so this is significant because it sets the foundation for the Prussia as we know it, the dominant military power of this era. Another way he's able to justify his absolutism and to solidify his absolutism is he's constantly fighting wars. And he's like, look, man, we need a bigger army. We need more money. I need to be able to tax more. And you need to help me protect from this other group. And he engages in wars against all sorts of other groups. France, Sweden, Poland, the Tatars, who come invading from the Russian steppes. I mean, he's able to constantly create warfare, and because of this, constantly get money. The way he's able to prevent full-scale revolt from the Junkers is these new taxes are generally towards middle classes and the rising towns, not the nobility and the landlord. So he's taxing new money, new economic growth instead of old agricultural land. And this kind of keeps the lords and the Junkers appeased and prevents them from getting a little too out of control or frustrated. He dies, and he was replaced by Elector Frederick III, who rules for a long time. He's a relatively weak ruler. He's really focused on trying to imitate Louis XIV, but he's not nearly as successful at it. He's focused on, he tries to build this really nice palace, and I mean, he does. He doesn't try to. He builds a really nice palace. He's all about creating art and music and building up culture in Prussia rather than army. So his father, Frederick William, Elector Frederick William, was focused on building up the army. Elector Frederick III is focused on building up culture and music. And then things starts to get a little bit tricky here, because the main thing he does is he earns the title King Frederick I of Prussia. And that's an honorary title that the Holy Roman Emperor gives him. He doesn't crown himself that. He's just given the title because he allows his soldiers to fight during the War of Spanish Succession, which, is nice of him, but expected. And so he goes from Elector Frederick III to King Frederick I. And this can be a little bit confusing. So when we talk about Frederick III, which we rarely do because he's not that important a figure, we're also talking about King Frederick I, who is different from Frederick William. So again, just to make things as confusing as possible, we have Frederick William, the Elector Frederick William to Frederick I, and then we have King Frederick William I. So, and he is an important figure. He's a very important figure in Prussian politics and Prussian history. He is known as the Soldier's King because he is all about war. He is very much about war. He establishes Prussian absolutism. He takes further power away from the Junkers and creates this Prussian absolutism that really exists for like a really long time, all the way up until Bismarck, really. He creates the best and strongest army in Europe because the army is his passion. He's always wearing his uniform. He lives a disciplined life and forces the people around him to live a disciplined life. He searches constantly for the best and the strongest soldiers. He's really infatuated with height. He tries to get everyone in his army to be over 6 feet tall. So there's this intimidation factor, and that's also really important at this time given the warfare tactics that are going on. But he genuinely believes deep down that the welfare of the king himself and his nation is entirely dependent upon the army. And so he uses this high militarization to take power away from the nobility. He's constantly building the army and strengthening the army and needing the money, and so he doesn't have time to deal with the nobility, so he goes to direct taxes. He takes away their rights and gives it over to the soldiers. Eventually, this creates conflict with the Junker class, that noble landlord class. His rising power and the army's absolute obedience to him instead of noble's private army, the army of Prussia is absolutely loyal to King Frederick William I, is a real threat to destroy the Junkers as a class. And so what ends up happening is instead of fighting them and struggling against them and dealing with their pushback and subversion, Frederick William finds a solution where he basically forces them to join the army. And so the Junkers switch from being the noble landowning class to being the officer corps in the new Prussian army. And yes, they still own land, but now their power and their prestige comes from who they are in the military. So Prussia and the military kind of become one, and Prussia's often called Sparta of the North because they take their militarization so seriously. He expands the army even more significantly to 83,000 men, which is, again, at this time, that is a huge number. That's the likes of which we won't see for a long time. He's got the most, well, it's like the fourth largest army in Europe, I think, at this time. But given the population size he has, I mean, the percentage that he has is gigantic. Plus, it's not only a large army, it's the most disciplined, it's the best armed, and it's the most effective fighting force. And he takes this highly disciplined and regimented life that he learns and loves in the military, and he applies it to his governing style so that the government runs as efficiently as the army. Everyone knows their place, they follow the orders of the commanding officer, and because of this, he has a really effective government, and all of society falls into line, and suddenly you have this country that is just military, and it's this whole fortified nation that's focused on the military. And so, unlike Austria, the Prussians are able to exert absolutism throughout their entire nation, and a huge part of that is their dependence upon the army and their forcing of people to accept and fall into that lifestyle.